Imagine being in the audience when a lanky young man with a gentle, almost childlike voice took the stage, stared wide-eyed at the crowd, and began to sing the Mighty Mouse theme song, all the while looking as if he himself wasn't entirely sure what he was doing there. Yet he was sure. The tension in the room was both whimsical and oddly dramatic. People weren't sure whether to laugh or check if the poor fellow needed some help. Then, almost without warning, he'd produce something so unexpectedly hilarious that the entire crowd would break into uproarious laughter, though half of them probably couldn't articulate why. That was the magic of Andy Kaufman. He was the rare kind of comedic innovator who soared to fame by transforming the very concept of comedy itself, mixing confusion, wonder, and delight in a way few had ever experienced. And yet, at the height of his fame, he seemed just as happy to upset an audience as he was to elicit their applause. In that sense, Andy Kaufman was sometimes less of a stand-up comedian and more of a living question mark. Are you supposed to be entertained, offended, completely bamboozled, or maybe all three at once? He gave people a riddle they found so compelling they couldn't stop trying to solve it. And that's why his appearances on national television, most especially on late-night shows, and famously on Saturday Night Live, live on in cultural memory as some of the most shocking and mesmerizing moments in the live comedy. Growing up in Great Neck on Long Island, New York during the 1950s, he was the eldest child in a middle-class Jewish family that at first glance appeared perfectly ordinary. His father, Stanley, was a costume salesman, and his mother, Janice, was a homemaker. He had a younger brother, Michael, and a sister, Carol. Andy was described as a sensitive, introspective child who relished creating shows in his room, playing imaginary games, and talking to an audience he imagined was watching. Even as a toddler, he'd entertain relatives by standing on a chair and performing nursery rhymes. Most kids do something similar, but Andy never seemed to lose that sense of childlike joy, that willingness to inhabit fantasies so fully that to him they became entirely real. Yet by the time Andy reached his teenage years, the 1960s were in full swing across America, and the cultural fabric was changing at a breakneck pace. Music, art, civil rights, and a generational shift toward questioning authority were all in the air. Andy, however, lived a bit in his own bubble. While other teenagers got into rock bands or political activism, Andy would retreat into his bedroom, filming homemade television shows and practicing impressions. Elvis Presley was a favorite, even though he hardly shared these hobbies with the outside world. He found an early spiritual practice in transcendental meditation, which became a cornerstone in his life. Rarely discussed in mainstream coverage, it seems that Andy meditated regularly from his late teens onwards, drawing on it for creative focus, relaxation, and emotional balance. By the early 1970s, he started performing at small clubs and coffee houses along the East Coast, perfecting what he called his foreign man character, a guileless immigrant from a fictitious country. This shy, apologetic foreign man would attempt jokes, do spotty impressions, and lull the audience into a sense of mild pity, only to burst into a startlingly accurate Elvis impersonation that left everyone thunderstruck. That comedic turn became one of Andy's trademarks, and it caught the eye of talent scouts and TV producers. Soon he found himself at the intersection of the stand-up comedy world and experimental performance art. He was booked on the very first episode of Saturday Night Live in 1975, famously lip-syncing to a record of the Mighty Mouse theme. It was a bizarre piece of television, minimal, awkward, and comedic gold if you had the taste for the bizarre. In an era that was just beginning to explore new comedic frontiers, Andy's routine wasn't just fresh, it was transformative. Yet as his career began to take off, there was a simultaneous sense that Andy wasn't at all comfortable following the paths laid out for typical rising comedians. He wasn't the guy who'd do talk show banter and trot out a quick comedic monologue. When Taxi offered him a regular role as Latka Gravas, the sweet but linguistically confused mechanic, Andy initially hesitated. He famously asked to have certain conditions met before he'd agree to participate. Among them, the producers had to allow his alter ego Tony Clifton to guest star on the show. Tony Clifton was crass, loud, and often drunken, a lounge singer persona that Andy used to push his comedic boundaries to the absolute limit. The producers, enamored with Andy's comedic genius, agreed. What they didn't fully anticipate was how Tony Clifton would bring chaos to their set, insulting cast members and production staff before eventually being escorted off the lot. Later, it would be revealed that Tony Clifton was sometimes not even Andy at all. His writing partner and friend Bob Zmuda occasionally donned the Clifton persona just to keep the charade alive. The lines between fiction and reality blurred so thoroughly that even Andy's own colleagues couldn't keep track of what was real. While Taxi became a big hit, winning awards and featuring major stars such as Judd Hirsch, Danny DeVito, and Christopher Lloyd, Andy's feelings toward the show were mixed. On one hand, it gave him national recognition, financial security, and a larger platform than he'd ever had. On the other, he chafed under the constraints of a sitcom environment. He was restless, always wanting to push boundaries further than a half-hour comedy on network television would allow. He once said in an interview that he felt trapped. He was grateful for the success, of course, but the repetition of playing the same character week after week made him feel confined. Meanwhile, Andy's extracurricular performances grew more and more outrageous. He'd show up at small clubs, large theaters, or even broadcast specials and do things that left audience members wondering if they'd just been insulted, scammed, or roped into the world's strangest performance art. One infamous example took place at Carnegie Hall in 1979, a performance often cited as the pinnacle of Andy's artistry. He began the show with various comedic bits, elaborate stunts, and even a segment where he had 35 members of a local children's choir march on stage. But by the end, he announced that everyone in the audience was invited to follow him for milk and cookies, and then he chartered buses to take the entire crowd out for a snack. It was extravagantly silly, childlike, and unbelievably wholesome, yet also a logistical nightmare that delighted him to no end. Audience members often recounted that it felt like stepping into Andy's imagination, spontaneous, full of wonder, and a bit chaotic. Even at the peak of his comedic powers, Andy displayed a troubling seriousness when it came to wrestling. Yes, wrestling. He developed a bizarre storyline where he declared himself the intergender wrestling champion of the world and would challenge women from the audience to wrestle him on stage or on live television. In a modern context, that might sound deeply problematic, but at the time, Andy framed it as performance and comedic commentary on gender roles. He'd taunt female challengers, brag about male superiority, and generally play the part of a villain in a wrestling storyline, generating real hostility from audience members who didn't know if he was joking or genuine. This led to a heated on-screen feud with professional wrestler Jerry the King Lawler, culminating in an infamous match where Andy wore a neck brace and threatened to sue Lawler. The tension was so convincing that many people assumed their rivalry was legitimate. Only years later did Lawler and others admit that the feud was largely staged, though they never broke character publicly at the time. It was one of the earliest mainstream crossovers between celebrity culture and pro wrestling theatrics, a concept that would become commonplace decades later, but Andy was the pioneer. What's rarely mentioned in typical highlight reels is how exhausting this lifestyle was for Andy. While he thrived on the excitement of surprising people, he was also an introvert in many respects. The constant swirl of confusion he created around his personas could alienate even close friends. Some confided that they didn't always know how to separate Andy the friend from Andy the performer. He could be incredibly warm, spiritual, and childlike in one moment, then shift into a confrontational persona the next. Those shifts weren't always planned or signaled. They seemed almost involuntary, as though Andy existed at a precarious edge between personal authenticity and artistic invention. There's a poignant story told by Andy's friend and collaborator Bob Zmuda about a time they were working on a new bit in Andy's small Hollywood apartment. Andy became fixated on the idea of staging a kidnapping prank at a comedy club, an elaborate performance involving men in ski masks. And Bob was trying to talk him out of it, pointing out potential legal troubles. Andy, though, was insistent. He was so eager to push comedic boundaries that he couldn't resist the idea of making the audience believe something was truly going wrong. Bob asked him, "Why do you always have to take it one step further than anybody else?" And Andy reportedly just shrugged and said, "Because if I don't, then it's not worth doing." That short exchange reveals a man completely enthralled by the thrill of the unexpected, willing to risk misunderstanding or even legal issues to preserve the shock value of his art. As the 1980s rolled in, Andy found himself in a peculiar place. Taxi was canceled in 1983 after bouncing between networks, leaving Andy with more freedom but less structure. He was still making appearances on late-night talk shows and booking comedy specials, but his brand of performance art was starting to wear on mainstream audiences. Some found the intergender wrestling routines cruel or misogynistic, missing the layered satire he claimed was at the heart of the act. Others felt Tony Clifton had become more obnoxious than funny. Networks and promoters grew wary of investing in his stunts. Yet Andy pressed on, determined to keep blurring lines and defying audience expectations. He wasn't going to water down his vision. Then in late 1983, Andy started noticing persistent coughing fits and shortness of breath. Initially, he dismissed it, thinking maybe it was a cold or the result of stress from his never-ending pranks and performance schedules. But it got worse, and by January of 1984, he was diagnosed with a rare form of lung cancer, specifically large cell carcinoma, despite the fact he had never been known as a heavy smoker, though some accounts differ slightly on whether he occasionally smoked socially. His friends thought it had to be another elaborate stunt, and many fans believed the same rumor. People literally laughed when told he had cancer, assuming it was yet another Kaufman creation. Sadly, it was not. By the time doctors caught it, the cancer was already advanced. Andy sought alternative treatments, including nutritional and psychic healing methods in the Philippines. He reportedly had a deep faith in the power of mind over body, partly influenced by his lifelong practice of meditation. In one interview, shortly before his death, he seemed serene, even optimistic, insisting that he would recover. But behind the scenes, his health was deteriorating rapidly. During this period, he told some friends he found solace in reflecting on his earliest memories, performing for his family as a child, or entertaining classmates in grade school. One friend recalled Andy saying, "I just want to make them smile again, like it was brand new." That wistful nostalgia suggests that at the end, Andy was yearning for a simpler form of the joy he once felt, unclouded by contracts, TV ratings, or the burden of shocking the world yet again. On May 16, 1984, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, Andy Kaufman died at the age of 35. The official cause was kidney failure stemming from metastatic lung cancer. His father, Stanley, was there, as were other close family and friends. Michael Kaufman, Andy's brother, has spoken about how surreal it felt to be at Andy's bedside in those final hours, knowing that the man who spent his life challenging reality was now succumbing to its most unforgiving truth. The public reaction was one of stunned disbelief because Andy had so thoroughly blurred the line between truth and performance. Countless fans assumed it was his greatest prank, that he'd disappear for a year or two and then reemerge triumphantly, laughing at the world's gullibility. In fact, a rumor persisted for years, some fans still cling to it, that Andy faked his death. It didn't help that Bob Zmuda and others would occasionally joke about how Andy had once mused he might stage his own death and come back 20 years later. This fueled the tabloids and conspiracy theories, overshadowing the genuine grief of those who knew and loved Andy in real life. Only after the funeral did the gravity of his passing settle in. Jerry Lawler, with whom he had famously feuded in the wrestling storyline, confessed that Andy was one of the kindest, most polite men he'd ever met off camera. Co-stars from Taxi like Marilu Henner and Tony Danza spoke of his gentle spirit, his childlike wonder when the cameras were off. More than once, those who eulogized him pointed out that Andy was never truly comfortable in the role of the celebrity. In interviews that emerged posthumously, he came across less as a comedic provocateur and more as a sensitive soul who found an unconventional way to express himself. One rarely discussed story involves an appearance at a small fundraiser in the early 1980s. Andy had been asked to perform to help raise money for a community center for underprivileged kids. Some of the audience members were from rough neighborhoods and had never heard of Andy Kaufman. He arrived, sat down cross-legged on the stage, and began telling a gentle, rambling story as though he were reading a bedtime tale. There was no punchline or comedic payoff, just a soothing voice spinning a yarn about finding one's place in the world. By the end of it, several children had joined him on stage, sitting around him as he spoke. The moment was so disarming and tender that afterward, even the parents who didn't know him said he felt like a gentle teacher or a kind uncle. It was a stark contrast to the abrasive stunts he was known for on television, revealing a side of Andy that very few people ever saw. That capacity for gentleness and empathy coexisted with his appetite for disruption, forming the central paradox of Andy Kaufman. He shattered norms, sometimes antagonized fans, and loved to spark controversy, but he was also profoundly empathetic and spiritual. He once told a friend that what he really wanted was to give people something to remember, something that wakes them up. And in so doing, he believed he could bring them closer to a childlike sense of wonder. No wonder people still debate whether he was a comedic genius, a performance artist, or just a practical joker. He was all three and more. Over the decades since his passing, critics, scholars, and fans have pored over every clip of Andy's performances, trying to decode his intentions and measure his impact on popular culture. He anticipated a wave of meta-comedy and reality-blurring performances that became more common in the internet age. Today, younger comics and online pranksters frequently cite Andy Kaufman as an inspiration, although few can replicate the earnest, almost mystical quality he brought to his illusions. He was also a precursor to what we now call shock comedy, yet his brand of shock was subtler, less reliant on profanity or blatant offense, more about rearranging the audience's sense of what was verse. These discussions, though, are not without controversy. Some critics argue that Andy's approach could be mean-spirited, humiliating innocent bystanders for the sake of a laugh. Others see him as a prophet of performance art, a rebellious figure who tested the audience's willingness to suspend disbelief. The wrestling matches, the Tony Clifton fiascos, and the onstage breakdowns all invite multiple interpretations. Was he exposing the gullibility of people, or was he simply a provocateur enjoying chaos? Did he care about the potential harm done, or was his moral compass overshadowed by his dedication to the performance? Historical debates aside, one thing is clear. Andy Kaufman left a monumental impression. Saturday Night Live never quite saw another performer like him. He forged a path for comedic risk-takers, showing that primetime television could be a space for the strange and unpredictable. Taxi remains a beloved show, but the episodes featuring Latka Gravas have an enduring cult following precisely because Andy imbued that odd foreign mechanic with genuine warmth and comedic unpredictability. And of course, the concept of mixing comedy with wrestling, performance art with reality, has become a staple in pop culture. Shows like WWE Raw and comedic personalities in modern wrestling owe a debt to Andy's willingness to step into the ring and confound people's expectations. Even years after his death, new anecdotes occasionally surface. A friend might recall a time Andy showed up unannounced at a family gathering, only to act as a butler named Jeeves for the evening, never revealing that he was actually Andy Kaufman. He never took credit for the performance, never tried to promote it afterward. That was characteristic of Andy, doing something bizarre simply because he loved the experience. Fame was at best a vehicle that allowed him to continue exploring these unusual interactions with reality, not an end in itself. Andy's story also touches on deeper themes of life, death, and legacy. Because of how thoroughly he blurred the boundaries of truth, his death forced people to confront the difference between theatrical hoaxes and genuine mortality. This was no wrestling storyline, no cameras, no stage. Just a young man succumbing to cancer, leaving a grieving family behind. There's a lesson in there, perhaps about how fragile our illusions are when confronted with something as stark and final as death. Andy might have loved the idea that people wouldn't believe his passing, but the heartbreak his actual loss caused was painfully real. It's a stark reminder that even the greatest tricksters among us cannot escape the ultimate truth of our shared vulnerability.